How do you feel?
I do not understand the question.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this very special episode of the Arkham Sessions. My name is Brian Ward. With me, as always, the psychologist to the superheroes, superheroines, and supervillains of Gotham City, and now somewhere in the Alpha Quadrant, the 23rd century, and the 20th century, Dr. Drea Letamendi. Hello, Drea.
Hi, Brian.
We have just watched Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, with many members of our Discord. We've got folks here ready to give us their rankings of the movies so far. We've got folks ready to give us questions. I have wanted to hear your thoughts on this movie in particular for a long time, mainly because every time we start one of the Star Trek movies, you ask, is this the one with the whales? And now this is the one with the whales.
Well, growing up and then into my adulthood, of course, I did not see the Star Trek movies. I had seen the second one. I had seen some of the newer ones, you know, with the Next Gen cast. Mm-hmm. So I always knew there was a movie with whales, and I never understood how a Star Trek movie involves, as its main plot, saving whales. Yeah. And so it does live up to my expectations.
Okay.
It definitely makes sense now.
Yeah.
I still have a lot of questions, and I also have a lot of notes.
Yeah.
That are mainly like, it's a lot of profanity and question marks.
Yeah.
But also some psychology notes. So
yeah, I'm sorry. They're colorful metaphors.
Oh, right.
All right. So for starters, you're not wrong in that Star Trek 4 is very much a gateway to many people into Star Trek. It's safe. It's entertaining. There isn't a defined villain necessarily. And it is, most of it takes place in the 20th century. By the way, keep in mind that this was 1986. In, let's see, 86, 87, 88, 89, 91. 6 years from now, Khan is jettisoned off of Earth due to the eugenics wars. 1992 is when Khan supposedly gets jettisoned into space. A lot happens between 1986 and 1992. Yeah, you're trying to wrap your head around that, aren't you?
I don't understand, because this was written after that movie.
Uh-huh.
Well,
and
well after the series that set that plot point, so they could have addressed it.
Let's just say a lot happens in the next few years. Okay. A little context onto this on this movie and why it is the way it is. Obviously, Star Trek: The Motion Picture was going to be very heavy, hard science, and the defined villain is V'ger. Star Trek 2 becomes more of a naval sort of base movie, submarines in space, photon torpedoes, and lots of shooting, shoot 'em up. Star Trek 3 becomes pretty heavy. This was a movie that Harve Bennett and Leonard Nimoy specifically said, I don't want a villain. I want it to be lighthearted. I want it to be entertaining. It was originally supposed to come out at Christmas, but then ended up coming out over Thanksgiving, which ended up helping it considerably.
Okay.
And everyone came away from this movie thinking it was the best of the bunch for a long time. I mean, in terms of like reviewers, critics, I mean, Roger Ebert said it was the best of the movies at that point. So and I have to believe that a lot of that is because of just how lighthearted the film is. It's so easy to digest, but it also does exactly what Trek does best, which is give a social commentary. Tell us about what we need to save on this planet, and in this case, it's whales. So I'm interested now to hear your ranking, because up to this point it was 1, 2, 3. Now that you've got 4 in the mix, and being a non-Trekkie, a new Trekkie, we'll call it.
Yeah, I think I'm a new Trekkie.
You're a new Trekkie. Where's your ranking live now?
So my ranking now, or my rankings now, are 1, 2, 4, 3.
Yeah, three is always going to be somewhere towards the bottom. I will say that I think that after having just seen this movie for the first time in a while, Nimoy really comes into his own as a director of this film, and it does a much better job than he did in 3. But that being said, he didn't have nearly as much control as you would normally give someone in Star Trek, for Star Trek 3. In Star Trek 4, he was given a lot more power to do what he wanted. The original script, they didn't love. So they brought back Nicholas Meyer, the writer-director of Star Trek 2, to help write Star Trek 4. He and Harve Bennett, the producer, co-wrote the script. All the 20th century stuff is Nicholas Meyer. And I got to believe that that's the successful piece of the formula here. I mean, Harve Bennett's great, but I think Nick Meyer really is what made these first 6 movies so great, because I'll go ahead and give you a little spoiler. He also wrote and directed Star Trek 6. So
okay, so that's promising.
Yeah.
I do have to say it. So this is positioning itself in the mid 80s. It was made in the mid 80s with a sentiment of mid 80s social politics, the anxieties that people have. I was a real young kid. I always tell people, like, I grew up in the late 80s, 90s, because I sort of came into my own as an adolescent in the 90s. So
Sure.
more of a 90s kid.
Yeah.
But what I appreciate is that because of the time travel, like you're saying, you sort of have this ability to address those worries, anxieties, and some of the consequences that were heavy on people's minds. And, again, this is mostly from my understanding of history, that climate anxiety and concerns about the environment and animals and equality as it relates to an ecosystem, that was really being fostered in the 70s and 80s, as I understand that. This film probably appealed to the emotions of a lot of people who were wrestling with those psychological anxieties.
Yeah.
And I imagine that's why it was so popular. And I'm also thinking about the blockbusters of this time, all the movies that we really love to this day. Many of them were, in terms of like the science fiction cinematic context, many of those films were apocalyptic and dark and devastating and horror-esque, like horrific.
Yeah.
And I think that I imagine, I don't know exactly, I know we've got listeners who are more expert in cinema and will probably tell me exactly where and when this was positioned, in late November of 86, but
Yeah.
maybe there was something of repair here, something that felt much needed in the bigger landscape of what cinema was doing.
Sure. Yeah, because at this point, you're right. I mean, you've got Aliens and other movies like that had really sort of become prominent in the science fiction. Yeah, this one's just a lot more fun. This one actually feels a bit more like Star Trek the original series in 66 to me,
Okay.
where, and there were cases where they went back in time and they did all the fun stuff. Now,
Okay,
think
so
about
they
this.
did time travel. This was one of the questions in my notes here.
Yeah.
Time travel had been portrayed in Star Trek prior to this movie.
Yeah.
Okay. So that wasn't a new concept. It didn't blow people's minds that the Star Trek crew were traveling, 300 years
Yeah.
into the past. I do have a lot of questions about the plot
Okay.
regarding the whales.
Okay.
But in my broader analysis of this, there's a big idea that I really like about it. And then, of course, there is the continuation of Spock's story. And
Yes.
unless I'm misunderstanding this is the third film in the arc of Spock discovering how to integrate his
Yeah.
emotional and logical self.
I'll say it's the fourth. I will say it's the fourth because remember, the first time we
right.
see him in the motion picture, he is failing the Kolinar,
That's right.
which is him supposedly ejecting all, just rejecting all emotion and becoming a purely logical being, and he fails that test and rejoins the rest of the crew of the Enterprise to go learn about V'ger. In Star Trek II, he really comes into his own by literally going with the most logical decision and deciding that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one, and he sacrifices himself. In Star Trek 3, he can't quite figure out why they did that, mainly because he's not himself. He is still, and we even see in Star Trek 4, he is still trying to integrate his personalities. He's trying to come back to being the Spock that we all know and love. I mean, even Kirk's like, "What's the deal? Why don't you call me Jim anymore?" And so he's still fighting that within himself. But I have not been able to wait for you to see this movie for this very reason. I feel like this is the perfect sort of end of that Spock arc over the course of 4 movies.
Yeah.
And it all comes down to, how do you feel? And that to me is like, I was giddy in anticipation, waiting for you to hear the scenes.
Is that a
with,
question you
how
want to
do you
ask
feel?
me?
How do you feel? Because I do know you relate a lot to Spock. How do you feel, Treya?
I feel fine.
Okay.
Look, I love me a good fish out of water story.
Yeah.
That is, in my heart, the kind of story that I relate to, that just holds a lot of important narratives about identity and finding oneself and understanding oneself in the context of our social world,
Yeah.
building your worldview. Like, I could go on and on. So the fish out of water story is very honestly just very special to me as a narrative. This has so many elements. The obvious one being literal whales being taken from their original home and transported to a new home-ish, a new time, but already being attacked just in terms of their existence. So the pressure to become a fish out of water is there. It's a necessity. The fish out of water story with time, going from one time construct to another, and understanding the cultural nuances, the language, communication, the expectations, all those bits usually given to us through humor.
Yeah.
Love it. Like, just love that it's a way for us to reflect on the day-to-day mundaneness that actually makes us really smart and special. Like, oh, those are all things that we take for granted, and we have to kind of think more critically about how we communicate and how we are and how we interrelate. And then you've got the fish out of water with Seventh Heaven mom, Catherine Hicks. I remember her actor name, but I sadly don't remember what she was called in the film. Do you?
I literally just watched it. Well, the moment
Whale
you said,
oceanography, whale expert.
The moment that you said Catherine Hicks, I was like, yeah, I'm with you.
Her name is Catherine Hicks.
I know exactly what you're talking about. No, she was Jillian Taylor, Dr. Jillian Taylor.
Dr. Jillian Taylor, loved her. Yeah. Loved her passion, her undying vision, and she is a fish out of water in her own time, and the loneliness of her perception, of her intelligence, of her knowing that these beings transcend, human culture and human intelligence and the need to save them. She's alone in that. Mm-hmm. And then she's a fish out of water somewhat when I'm giving the ending away. I'm assuming everyone who's listening has seen this movie by now. When she insists to be transported with Admiral Kirk back to the future.
Yeah.
Back to the 23rd century.
Yeah.
To be with the whales ostensibly, but also to find purpose and meaning in that time. So she's going to be a fish out of water continuously, for the
but like all you scientists, super excited to learn. She's got 300 years of catching up. She's super excited to join a science vessel. What's interesting, though, is she convinces Kirk to let her join them because she's the only one who knows anything about whales in the 23rd century. But instantly, Starfleet ships her off to someplace else. It's like we don't need you on Earth, where we only have 2 whales in existence that are now tasked with repopulating the species, and we're not going to keep you here to monitor their progress. We're going to send you to other places. It's like, bye, Dr. Taylor. Thanks for your help.
Yeah, and I think they needed that to create the conflict. There are 2 conflicts happening in separated by hundreds of years. The conflict in the 80s is, of course, the devastation of the species.
Yeah.
And I think too, we're meant to understand that it's not just the species that that humans are neglecting, mm-hmm. But that there's a wider ecological anxiety happening that we're grappling with. And the best way to tell that story is with these 2 lovely personified whales, Stephen and Greta. I forgot their names.
George and Gracie.
Oh, George and Gracie.
Yeah.
Named after some famous people.
George Burns and his wife, Gracie, who were a comedy duo.
No idea who those people are.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what's interesting too is when I think about it, I remember they specifically wanted to tackle subjects like this, like some sort of socio-political or environmental cause. Some of the early ideas were actually like rainforest based. I mean, saving the rainforest, and stuff like that. But I like that it came down to living creatures, to whales. And by the way, Dr. Jones mentioned that he was going to call her Mrs. Camden. Was that her Seventh Heaven name?
Yes.
I never watched Seventh Heaven, but...
So for folks out there who watched Seventh Heaven, Catherine Hicks was the mom.
Yeah.
And the guy from the motion picture, so Stephen Collins was the dad.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting that they were both in different Star Trek movies before playing those roles. But a lot of us, again, who grew up in the 90s, we recognize them from that show.
Yeah.
Very wholesome show. I have to admit, I just sort of watched it because there wasn't a lot to choose from at the time, but not a terrible show, like a pretty entertaining show. And Jessica Biel's the eldest daughter, mm-hmm. is the most famous of the kids.
Oh, she came from Seventh Heaven.
She was the eldest daughter.
Got
mm-hmm. it. I hope I said.
Was this like
right.
a Party of Five sort of show?
I would say a more wholesome version of Party of Five, because he was a pastor, I think, so somewhat of a religious tone, but it wasn't foregrounded to the point where it was unrealistic or no conflict. Like there were lots of things. It very much felt like an after school special with a little bit more drama to it.
Not my jam. I like Dr.
Right.
Jillian Taylor instead.
Family-oriented drama is what Dr. Jones says in the chat right now. The last fish out of water metaphor is, of course, Spock, who's continuously living in a body and experiencing a brain that, in his experience of himself, his sense of self, is almost perpetually a fish out of water. And his journey,
especially between his two different families, the
Yes.
family of the Enterprise, or in this case, the HMS Bounty, and the family back home in Vulcan, who he has never fully embraced, who has never fully embraced him. I mean, he is a mixed race allegory in that he is half human, half Vulcan, and neither side can fully integrate him into their own communities. And he never feels like he's at home in either one of them.
and I do appreciate how they lift up those conflicts and some of the dissonance he feels internally about his sense of self, because we're seeing how other people treat him and react to him and have these expectations of him. Even the idea you're half this and half that also is kind of an illusion. For those of us who are mixed race, you're not half something and half another. You're 100% both.
Yeah.
So you're sort of fully integrating your cultural experiences, and your own internal experience seems full, like seems in best of times, pretty integrated. But then you receive these messages from people with interesting expectations. I think like how we saw with Spock interacting with his human mom. And she kind of projected some expectations onto him about his reactions to the, what is it, like a reprogramming exam or a reprogramming, what is that?
You mean like the test? That
Yeah,
he was taking?
it was an actual test.
Yeah, but I think it was because if you remember, his mind was in the body of McCoy. His Katra was in the body of McCoy in Star Trek 3. It was put back into Spock's body in the end of that film. He was clearly not himself, didn't know who he was, didn't know who his friends were, was not prepared to be Spock up to that point. I think this was sort of one of those tests that you have that you know, are you okay? Are you who you were before? Do you remember all of the information you had? Can you pass this test the way that a Vulcan should be able to pass these tests? Because the Vulcans are all about, tests.
Right. Well, and I'm not going to get too into the weeds about standard exams and the way in which we measure people's intelligence and traits. But that test was not made for him.
Well, it was.
What I mean
the
by
computer knew that he was half and half. That's why I asked the question.
The computer understands. The computer. This is like an AI conversation. Like it's iterative. It rebuilds and it quote knows that he's half human, half Vulcan. But what I mean, I think more broadly culturally, those materials, those exams, those things are not made for us. Like they're not made for, they're not created, standardized, and developed by us. And so his reactions, to be confounded, to be puzzled, to sort of feel like even the things I'm interacting with, I don't really feel like it gets me. I like those reactions in this film because it reminds us that he's quite unique and that he is trying to find his, not only who he is, but also I fundamentally believe that Spock is seeking some sense of contentment. Now, what that contentment, we'll wonder, is that emotional? Is that logical contentment? Is that emotional contentment? I'm not sure how to articulate that, but I see him as someone who's continuing to seek some sense of of a
balance.
Yeah, I want to say like an emotion or some sense of self that is beyond just what he knows from his culture.
And I think you've now seen it. I think at the end of this film, when he is telling his father, Sarek, tell mother back home, I feel fine. I think you now realized he has now come to terms with his half and half self. He has now figured out how to answer that question, because that's what confounded him in the beginning. He just had no concept for how to answer it. By the way, I wonder about that test. It's the only emotional question that we see. Was there a second half of the test that was going to follow? How do you feel? Or was the computer simply like, oh, now I need to ask you a human question because you're half and half?
And then we'll go back to all the
and then we'll go back
sciencey
to more
stuff.
science stuff. But the test ends there because he doesn't know how to respond to it. At the end of the film, he genuinely, it seems, knows how to respond. And I will tell you, going forward, Spock is this Spock. I'm not saying that he doesn't progress, but we've sort of now seen the arc of Spock, to who he becomes going forward in Star Trek V, Star Trek VI. And then in Next Gen, he becomes an ambassador and,
Sure.
All of that. But I feel like Star Trek 1 through 4 are Spock's story.
I agree. In the beginning of this movie, as you said, he's actually working toward integrating his soul back. Like the last movie was basically a rupture. And on the show, I know we talked about this not being such a terrible movie because it was demonstrating to us how the Vulcan culture works and that his soul needed to be joined again with his body and his mind. And so my understanding is that like this movie opens up with him continuing to kind of like repair that, but he's not yet fully. It's not that his soul hasn't connected to his body, because that's already happened. It's more like now that he's in these mental exercises trying to better understand who he is as a Vulcan, he's realizing there's a lot of work that he still needs to do as a person in understanding himself and positioning himself in the cultures that he's in between. So I do like how it starts, because it tells us that he still holds that curiosity. He's still developing. He's not necessarily certain about who he is. And of course, like a lot of these Star Trek movies, it does begin with this huge universal threat that in and of itself isn't necessarily like fully explained. It's sort of mysterious.
The probe.
But, this giant space probe. It's almost like a probe that then has another probe coming. It was weird. It was weird.
You mean the little orb that?
Yes.
I mean, that could be like an antenna of some kind. It would be, but you're talking about the probe that's hovering over Earth, desperately trying to communicate and getting increasingly frustrated when it's not getting a response and destroying the Earth. And it turns out they need it needs to get a response from humpback whales, which have been extinct for 300 years.
Yeah, there's actually a psychological concept that relates to that, not necessarily the space probe, but it's called the vending machine effect or extinction burst. And
what is that?
So it has a lot to do with behavior that isn't attended to. So you mentioned that this probe is sending these messages and they're alarming or they're urgent, listen to me, connect. And sadly, the Federation doesn't have the right communication or tools or mechanisms to respond.
Yeah.
And so it increasingly or gradually intensifies its messages. So then it destabilizes a ship or two, and then it really gets destructive. So this is a language of behavioral psychology where we tend to increase our sometimes our externalizing and even maladaptive behavior. We can get destructive when people are not attending to us. And a lot of times we use this language with children who are being parented or who are receiving feedback from a caregiver or a parent or adult. And sadly, a lot of children are seen as like, oh, that's a bad kid, or that kid is being destructive, or that kid has angry outbursts. And the reality is like they're trying different ways to get the feedback or attention that they seek, and they're sort of being ignored, or they're not being attended to. And so they increase that type of behavior until it becomes, it could be very maladaptive or destructive. I mentioned the extinction burst. That's when it reaches a certain point where it actually does stop.
Yeah.
So in this case, had they not been able to communicate with the probe, the extinction burst would have been possibly a huge, huge destructive act by the probe, and then it would have gone away.
Yeah. I appreciate at the end, too, this, in the beginning, Spock theorizes that it could be something other than human because the probe appears to be speaking a language, and the hubris of humans to believe that they must be talking to us is pretty great. I like at the end of the film, we see that even physically, the probe and the whales are mirroring
alike.
One another. They are getting into the same positions in order to communicate. You know, the one whale is facing up, the other is facing down, but they're facing toward space, and the probe shifts its position as well in order to sort of mimic. And I like this idea that, like, look, humans, you've only been here a short time. There are things much wiser and older than you.
It's a lesson.
Yeah.
It ain't about you.
Yeah.
It's not always about you, and sometimes you need to just sit down and listen.
Yeah.
I would appreciate if you could explain the plot regarding the whales a little bit, because
you said that. You said you had questions about the plot and the whales. I thought that was pretty. I mean, we just described it, right?
Well,
the probe.
I understand.
The probe clearly came to Earth at some point prior to humanity existing, or at least being able to communicate with other space beings. And sent messages. It apparently would check in with Earth and would send messages to the most intelligent, most communicative, whatever version of life on the planet, which happened to be humpback whales. The whales would then give it its response, and the probe then goes, cool, we're good. You guys are doing all right. And they leave. In this particular case, the whales have been extinct for 300 years because it said that due to over fishing and the hunting of whales for their for their blubber and all that stuff, that they go extinct in the 21st century. And because there is no way to communicate back to the probe is ripping the planet apart looking for its old friends. And because it can't find it,
increasing its destructive behavior, like we talked about.
Correct.
But so I get that.
So they go back in time to find whales. They go back to the late 20th century, 1986. Find George and Gracie living at an aquarium. George and Gracie are about to be set free back into the wild. Gracie's pregnant, which is good for 23rd century Earth, because now we're repopulating the species. There will now be 3 of them. I don't know where it goes from there. Because
so you're now the onion is being unpeeled. So here are my questions then, because I did understand. Like, I'll be clear, I do understand that they needed to pluck the whales out of the past, put them into the future, because they have the language needed to communicate effectively with this probe. Now look, there's like the acrobatics in my brain right now trying to figure out so whales are already pretty much going extinct in the late 20th century, and we're removing more of them. by putting them into the future. So my concern is you've now accelerated the extinction of these whales, and one's going to have
by 3.
Well, one's going to have a baby. Well, so that was my concern, is like your intervention is creating more problems for the 20th century.
So you're saying because presumably if time works, a certain way, you have now helped the 20th century lose whales.
In fact, did they cause the extinction that then led to the problem that they have in the 23rd century?
You might be onto something. Maybe.
And then now in the 23rd century, you've got this family of whales. What makes you so confident? That little baby hasn't been born yet. What makes you so confident?
Well, and who does the baby mate with?
Exactly.
You start getting into weird territory there. But presumably at this point, like, let's just say in the 23rd century, they have the ability to take the DNA and the whatever, and they can just start repopulating. Okay, hold on. Now my Trek brain is coming into play. Technically, they have the DNA sequences of those whales in the transporter from the Bounty because they beamed them onto the ship. You could now probably take that information and just start cloning whales. Done. And
okay. And I do want to give credit to Dr. Jones in our chat who explains, reminds us that the whales in captivity, the whales we're talking about who were removed from the 20th century were already very endangered themselves. Like, yes. I think Catherine Hicks was basically saying they're not going to survive in captivity or out of captivity. So there's the idea that they weren't necessarily going to be helping their own species.
Yeah, she said basically no whale born in captivity has ever survived in the wild. And they are releasing George and Gracie into the wild. But I don't know that George and Gracie were born in captivity. I can't remember if she made that assertion. But clearly a whale was about to be born in captivity. Gracie's calf was about to be born in captivity. And I think that is what she desperately wanted. Like, she needed the whales to go out into the wild so that the baby could survive.
Yeah. And it's actually a good idea for her to be a steward for them in the 23rd century because she is so attached to them. She calls them her whales. She's like, these are my whales. So it's probably good that they have her stewardship, and she'll do all of the science necessary to keep them alive in the 23rd century.
Except they didn't ship her off to go learn stuff at other planets. That's the thing. It's like you literally brought the one person that can tell you everything you need to know, and she goes and joins a science vessel. So the question is she really in love with those whales? Like, wouldn't she stay? Or is she now just being a human and is super excited about learning about other things? And like, oh, I know everything I need to know about whales. I'll download everything to you and leave. But Starfleet was like eager to get her on a vessel and ship her off because, they bring the bridge crew of the Enterprise back to stand trial. And at the end, she's like, I'm leaving. Bye.
She's so excited and not fazed by, suddenly moving from her home and being transported into the 23rd century.
She wasn't well respected at her job. She was high up within her job, but they even took the whales without telling her. Like,
Bob was a real nuisance.
Bob was trying to be friendly to her, but was ultimately disrespecting her position and her relationship with the whales. She had a crappy truck. She ate really awful food. The mushroom and pepperoni, and she drank Michelob. Like, we need to bring her to the 23rd century just to introduce her to some better, to a better lifestyle.
I gotta say, Catherine Hicks really owned that spotlight in this film. She really did such a fantastic job.
I want to ask you about Kirk, though, because this is a very different Kirk than we have met in the motion picture 2 or 3. Kirk has always been, since these movies started, stoic, Captain Horatio Hornblower. I can help us get out of here. He's basically your Bruce Wayne Batman character.
Yeah.
Only I can help. I need to take command of the ship.
A bit of a narcissistic personality to some degree.
And his temperament and his personality has only declined as the movies have progressed, because in 2, he is introduced to a son that never knew he existed, or, never wanted to know him, was eager to, see Kirk die as quickly as Khan was. He then in the 3rd movie loses his son, with whom he has now started to have a relationship. His relationship with Carol Marcus is, still what it was before. She's long gone. The 4th movie sees a Kirk that is giddy on Earth. Like he's funny. Mm-hmm. He's lighthearted. He understands the situation and the importance of the situation, but doesn't shy away from being jovial and making jokes. And I believe that's Harve Bennett and Leonard Nimoy saying this is the kind of movie we want.
Right.
But you've now introduced a Kirk who seems to have a large weight removed from him now that he has his old friend back and is captaining a starship again.
It seemed like they tried to create a moment of closure or transformation or transition for him when Saavik, not Saavik, told him, I never got a chance. This is at the very top of the movie, basically, where she says, I never really got a chance to tell you about your son and what kind of person he was. And even though that interaction was very short, I believe it served to pivot him from that darkness and pivot him away from his bereavement in some sense of that toward something more hopeful and optimistic. And similar to the other Star Trek movies, they're trying to protect mankind. And so this sense of like, yes, I experienced personal loss that's present, but there's this kind of post-traumatic growth happening. What can I do? I'm here. I have the power and leadership and ability. I know how to time travel. I can actually, I'm going to break some rules because that's what we do. But I'm going to use my agency and my life. I'm going to dedicate my life to saving other people.
Yeah.
And you're right. That is very different than the Kirk who is vengeful and devastated and in a lot of pain.
And traipsing around the cosmos is a game for the young. He no longer feels old.
And he doesn't look old either.
Yeah.
Like, it's so
he
weird.
He looks younger in this film than he does in any of the other movies.
Yeah, he does.
There's got to be something to say about that. What psychology will do, what good mental health will do to your to your body. It will give you that sheen, that glow. Yeah, he's and at the end they punish him because he's brought up on 9 charges by the Federation for attacking Starfleet officers, for stealing the Enterprise, for destroying the Enterprise, for doing all of that. And then at the end they're like, look, your only punishment is that you're going to be demoted to captain. And as a result of that, your job is no longer going to be sitting behind a desk. You're no longer going to be administrative. You are going to do the one thing that you have shown you excel at more than anyone else. You are going to lead a starship. And they give him command of the NCC 1701A, the new Enterprise, which looks just like the old Enterprise, but it's new, it's souped up, shinier on the inside, it's brighter. I love that contrast too. On the Bounty, on the Klingon ship that they had been in the whole time, super dark, super red, and then at the end they get onto a very bright and shiny new Enterprise.
I have to admit something that I was kind of scared to say in the last 3 or 4 episodes.
Okay.
But I think I feel enough psychological safety in this chat and on this live episode to say this now.
Okay.
I have a version, some interesting version of Federation starship blindness.
Oh, they all look the same to you?
I cannot tell the difference between these. I can see the Birds of Prey and how they're different.
Yeah.
I don't know how the Defiant and the Reliant and the they just look the same.
So I will say, so you're not wrong. I mean, there are classes of ship. So like the Enterprise is a Constitution class. The Reliant is not. So the Reliant basically still has the saucer section, but it's got the warp nacelles on the bottom, and it's got the photon torpedo bay up at the top, and all that stuff. It's still the same quote unquote Navy, so it's still going to look similar, but it is now a different. That's a different class of ship. The Constitution class, they're all going to kind of look like the Enterprise. And by the way, the Yorktown looks identical to the Enterprise. There are sister ships in the same way that, like, if you go walk on a battleship today and then you go walk on a battleship, a separate battleship, you're going to be walking on basically the same ship.
It's kind of the same.
It's called different, and all that. But your different vessels, your different classes are going to be,
And I'm being told in the chat that I'm not alone to kind of have this this blindness to kind of the difference in the ships.
Yeah. And by the way, this comes to help later in production when the same Klingon ship is seen doing, they'll reuse shots that they've already done because it doesn't matter. It's a different ship, but it's the exact same ship, so that all helps for production wise.
I very much admire the folks who can see different ships and notice the different details and the nuances and just kind of nerd out.
Like, to me, the Reliant is my favorite looking ship of all time. Love it.
Yeah.
I love it so much. And I understand why you can't necessarily see the difference. It is squatter. I mean, it's a smaller
Oh, I know.
ship.
Well, we have a lot of the Hallmark ornaments. We're not sponsored by Hallmark, but boy, do we post a lot about Hallmark.
I sponsor a lot of Hallmark.
They really should send us free stuff. But wink, wink. We have a lot of the Hallmark ornaments that are the ships, and when I look at them, they do look different. I can see how different they are.
Yeah.
I think on screen, especially when I'm only seeing one of them, I'm like, okay, I don't know which ship this is.
But you're also not wrong in that the Enterprise A looks identical to the Enterprise before. It's the same ship.
Yeah.
But the Excelsior that was right in front of it looks very different.
I couldn't.
It's bigger, smoother angles. Like, it's not as angular a ship. It looks like, if I were to put the two of them next to each other, you would definitely see a difference between the Excelsior and the Excelsior's longer.
And Aaron tells us in the chat that some of the Romulan and Klingon ships can be quite similar looking.
Yes.
And are they all called Birds of Prey?
No, but the Klingons and the Romulans both have Birds of Prey.
Well, see, that's confusing. What is happening?
I mean, look, talk to. I mean,
you know what? We just saw last night. Batteries not included.
Yeah,
those ships I can tell apart.
That's so crazy because to me, I mean, you can kind of tell them apart, but the mama and daddy.
Why are you giving them genders?
The mama and daddy.
That's unnecessary.
Well, only one of them. That's unfair of me. I understand, but one of them gave birth. The other one didn't. I don't know. Look. Those two ships, I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell them apart.
They were so different.
The three, I could tell you.
The three babies.
Yeah, those look different, but I could not tell you which of the two others were.
I love this idea that our show has taken an off ramp toward Batteries Not Included. Another 80s movie. I do have to, the other notes that I have, because I'm realizing we're getting to the end of our hour here, but I continue to appreciate Spock's efforts to learn not just about 1980s culture, which we should talk a little bit more about, but also to interact with his friends in ways that he's interested in. You know, again, he feels like a fish out of water for a number of reasons. He is fond of his friends. He chooses to be in alliance with them, even though his friends are charged with these crimes.
Well, he's also the catalyst for why they were charged.
Sure,
with these
I think he
crimes.
sees that connection. But mentally, I believe he feels supportive of them and he wants to be on their side.
Yeah.
And yet there are times when he doesn't communicate well with them, or rather they don't communicate well with him.
Yeah.
And he doesn't interpret metaphor. He doesn't know the slang and the different sayings. And
Let's be clear, though. Kirk was the one trying to explain the slang and the colorful metaphors, but he was also using them incorrectly.
And so
The double dumbass on you is not necessarily an 86.
But that's why I like this, is that Kirk finally has to be in a situation where he's the fish out of water, where he doesn't understand necessarily the way that language is. I think that Kirk understands, and there's actually a mention here in the chat about this. Kirk understands the historical context of why people talk the way, like he has his own interpretation of why his communication style is different.
And remember, in his own apartment, he has collections of old artifacts and old weaponry from.
He's fascinated with human history.
With history, but he doesn't fully connect, because even by the time he gets back to 86, he's an idiot. I mean, he doesn't know that $100 isn't a lot for his antique glasses.
Well, and I think it gives us more empathy for Spock, who's continuously, perpetually in that situation where he doesn't necessarily comprehend the communication among his peers, and he asks questions and he tries to learn. And I think a lot of people who are neurodivergent are able to connect to that idea. I don't understand that metaphor. I've never heard that saying before. Even in this film, the pizza guy said, who's going to get the bad news? And I looked at you and I said, I have no idea what he's talking about. What do you mean, who's going to get the bad news? Is there even more bad news than the whales getting extinct? What is happening?
You think the waiter was like, I got some more bad news for you?
I thought he was going to give bad news, or something was wrong with the food, or he didn't have mushrooms or something.
But he was handing them the check as well.
I saw that, but I don't understand that saying. I've never heard that before.
Yeah.
And even if I've never heard that before, I couldn't connect to that level or layer
This is like
of
when
sarcasm.
Like you with kick rocks and pound sand and
Some of these sayings that, I'll say very openly here, sometimes culturally, sometimes just my brain isn't as neurotypical. And so, no, I if you're going to say something, my expectation is you're going to tell me in a literal way. And Spock is like that pretty much 100% of the time.
Yeah.
And for him to be this very beloved main character, foregrounded, and to have this main arc in these movies and be neurodivergent, I think is like a huge positive, remarkable thing about Star Trek from its origins, or from this characterization, this set of narrative, this series of movies that happen in the 80s and throughout. So I really liked that.
And Spock outlives them all. Like he's still a character in Next Gen. He lives to join the Kelvin timeline.
He's in Strange New Worlds. It means that Spock, this is like now a bigger conversation outside of this movie, but Spock belongs to us. Like Spock is really bridging something here. Spock is really a member of our cultural media society, and we keep bringing him in. And I think that says a lot about who we are collectively.
Yeah. I will say that if my headcanon is true, then it's possible Kirk outlives everyone else, because I still believe that Picard never left the Nexus. That's a movie. That's a conversation to have in generations. But yeah. I'm so excited that you finally got to see this movie, and I'm so sorry that you now have to watch Star Trek V, The Final Frontier.
Well, none of these movies have been unwatchable, terrible, lacking psychology. They're all giving me something to think about and talk about.
Yeah. Well, and this one, Star Trek. Look, I'm not going to crap on Star Trek V because it is not well received. It is an odd film after all, and by that I mean odd numbered. It's odd as well, but it's we go looking for God.
I'm here for it.
Yeah.
I'm open to it. So as we wrap up, we have a couple questions in the chat that I want to ask you, and then we will.
Feisty emoji. Okay, look. This is a conversation. All right, this is seriously a conversation that has to wait until we analyze Generations, which we have not put on our list of movies, but I believe that because it ends Kirk's arc, we should continue our analyses through Generations.
Like a bonus.
Yeah,
Does that
it
happen
should be a
after
bonus.
the sixth movie?
Yes. So,
Okay.
So Generations is immediately after 6.
So maybe we'll plan for tacking that on without getting the vote. So I do want to ask you this question from the chat. Dr. Jones says, I want to know how they can quote Hamlet and T.H. Lawrence, but can't recognize how a Russian asking questions about a naval base in the 1980s Cold War U.S. might not be a good idea. So some understanding of history, but then
it's all
some not great choices here.
Yeah, but it's also all superficial knowledge of history. So like Kirk has all the ancient guns and weapons in his apartment, but doesn't understand cultural, whatever. By the way, could we also talk about the fact that so in 66 there were episodes that took place in the 20s. So we're talking about 40 years difference between when the show was being made and the era in which they were having adventures. Let's talk about the fact that this movie takes place in 1986, which was 96, 2006, 2000, like 40 years ago. Like this is the equivalent of like in 66 them making an episode where everybody has fun and goes back to wear pinstripe suits and fedoras and Tommy guns. And like if you made this movie now, like this, it's the equivalent. We're going back to 86.
Wait.
Yeah.
What?
Well, like I'm just thinking about the fact that if you look at 60, like that, like those episodes would seem so far away, but now it's sort of like saying if you're in Back to the Future, if you made Back to the Future now, we would actually be going back to the 90s.
Yeah.
It's so much
this
different.
Movie going back in time to the 80s.
Yeah.
The 80s doesn't seem super long ago, but then when you do the math, you're right. It's 40 years ago, almost 40 years ago. So that's
and as someone born in 77, I don't like that. I don't like thinking about these things. I literally, during Star Trek Las Vegas, celebrated my 46th birthday. I don't love time travel being so willy-nilly as to be within my own lifetime.
Yeah.
Ugh,
well,
it's the worst. By the way, though, could you, as we've talked about over the courses of these movies, motion picture, extremely expensive. Harve Bennett was brought in to produce Star Trek II and was specifically asked, can you use your television background to make a movie for way cheaper? And he said, 100%. And so they made movies that were literally on two bridges of two ships for the majority of the movie. Star Trek 3 made for ever so slightly more than Star Trek 2. Star Trek 4 all takes place in San Francisco, basically. I mean, it's like, how much are permits? And we're going to put some crews.
And they're really walking those streets.
They're really walking those streets. There are people who interact with them on the streets who were literally pedestrians.
And your friend Kirk Thatcher is the very well identified punk rocker on the bus.
Yeah.
Who then went on to play a character in a Marvel. Disney Plus Marvel
Werewolf,
short.
Werewolf by Midnight, and is a wonderful director in his own right. I mean, if you saw the Muppets Haunted Mansion, he directed that film. He comes back to play. Punk on the Bus for season 2 of Picard.
Oh, that's right. Oof, we don't talk about season 2 of Picard in this house. But that is our time. I did get through a good amount of my notes, and we did get a couple of the questions. I did write down a lot of times Prime Directive with a lot of question marks. Like I wondered, maybe you have a moment just to comment on that.
Similar to the way Scotty said, how do we know that he didn't invent transparent aluminum?
It all kind of answers itself.
Yeah, they're breaking the Prime Directive.
Maybe the Prime Directive is different with your own people. Because I know that when you go to other people, you're not supposed to interfere with their cultures, but you can interfere with your own culture.
But this culture has not yet achieved warp drive. It has not yet. Had first contact with the Vulcans.
Pre-first contact.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, with that, I'm going to wrap this up. I just want to say thank you to all the wonderful community members who joined us for the watch along, and for those of you who stayed for our live recording of the show. Please let us know if there's anything you'd like us to stream in the future. Maybe that's what we'll do for our bonus movie for Star Trek. But again, thanks so much for being here and being a part of this conversation, asking questions, engaging, interacting. Again, I've been just so welcomed by the Trek community, and this has been a very pleasant experience for me. I feel fine.
You feel fine. I do want to thank Feisty Emoji and it's Dr. Jones. Both of you are getting enamel pens. Be sure to send us a DM right here on Discord and let us know to where we should send those enamel pins. I also have some people to thank from our Patreon, because they're the ones who make episodes like this possible. Dr. Jerome Anderson, Antonio Lopez, who also joined us today, but couldn't stay for the entire episode. Candy B, Kevin Ortel, Todd Stashwick, our Star Trek friend.
Our
captain. Hero's Journey Fitness, my best friend Frank Moeller, Mark Pepper, Anthony Carrera, Michael Pruitt, Eric O'Sullivan, Rachel Acevedo Hoffman, Ruben Gonzalez, Dr. Girlfriend, and my father, Carl Ward. Thank you all for making these episodes possible. We couldn't do them without you. And until next time, Drea, why don't you tell the good folks where they can find you online?
You can find me online on my website, drdreapsychology.com. I'm also still on X.
Ugh. Maybe not for long.
I don't know, for long. But you can find me on Threads and Instagram, Dr. Drea Psychology, and on Mastodon and Blue Sky and all those others, pretty much under Dr. Drea.
You can find me at bward028 on the Twitters. On Instagram, I'm at b_ward028. I think I just joined Blue Sky as at Brian Ward. I got
Congratulations.
I know. Wow. That's how I know that social media can't possibly live for very long, if I'm the first Brian Ward to join. And you can follow us both at Arkham Sessions on Twitter, at the Arkham Sessions on Instagram. Email us at arkhamsessions@gmail.com. Join us on Facebook. Come find us on Discord, where you can participate in events like this one. And of course, Patreon. Follow our family over at Fanbase Press for a lot of cool comics and other podcasts. And until next time, I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Drea Letamendi.
And together we are
the Arkham Sessions.
Do you have a message for your mother?
Yes. Tell her I feel fine.